And don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast. Let's go to line number one and welcome our featured guest. And what we've been doing here for the past couple of weeks is taking a look at labor history. And this is all part of Labor 131 to celebrate the 131st anniversary of the creation of Labor Day as a national holiday. Our featured guest today is Trish Kolar. Trish is an assistant professor. She's a historian of energy, work, and politics, and she's been interested in studying the use of energy as a lens through which to study political life, social relations, the economy, and the environment. That's an interesting take. Trish, welcome to America's Workforce. And you are at Georgetown, but not the Georgetown in Washington, in Qatar. Talk to me about that.
Georgetown has been in Qatar for 20 years now. I came here from the University of Chicago. I lived in Chicago for about 8 years, and was a grad student, postdoc, and labor organizer there. And I was lucky enough to land in a place where I get to learn to do history in a new way and have amazing students to do it with.
So talk to me about your research here. And I know you came out with a book last year, Energy Citizenship, Democracy in the American Century, which takes a look how modern U.S. citizenship has been shaped by coal miners and the fuel they extracted. So how has that happened? How has citizenship been shaped by coal miners? That's a show in itself. Go ahead.
I mean, one of the things I was really interested in is understanding how working people have shaped policy in U.S. history and politics more generally. And one of the really interesting things is when we look at what energy policy has meant, which is something obviously very important in the contemporary world, we can see that the way the United States made energy policy was really about negotiating with coal miners over the conditions of their work. And so coal miners understood that very early on in the 20th century, and they used it both to improve their own living conditions, their working conditions, to secure better social benefits for themselves and their families. And in the process, they remade what it meant to sort of have the right to energy, to have the right to survive the workday, and to define what it meant to sort of be a citizen and have a say over the conditions of your working life and your life as a person living in the United States.
Did you study how difficult those negotiations were? Because coal mining, first of all, very tough and very dangerous job. Many of the coal mines are non-union, and I know the union leaders spoke out about that. They try to organize those facilities, but did you cover that aspect as well?
So I talk a little bit in the book about negotiations with the BCOA, the Bituminous Coal Operators Association. Obviously, they're similar in anthracite. But in some ways, I came to focus less on the negotiations between the companies and the union, because that had already been written about a lot. Coal miners are obviously one of the most important groups of workers in U.S. history. And I became really interested in the way that they intervened in politics, whether that was at the state level, and more importantly for the book, at the national level. So really what you see a lot of are of coal miners strategizing on how to shape the outcome of federal policy, from things like black lung laws, to laws governing like how coal would be moved around the country, all the way to things that are shaping workers' lives more broadly, like the National Industrial Recovery Act during the New Deal.
So let's take a look at what happened in Western Pennsylvania in 1970. Apparently, there was a series of wildcat safety strikes, which pressured the government to do a few things. Can you take me back to that time? What actually happened and what did they accomplish?
Sure. So this happens in 1970, and it's really important to understand that in 1969, the federal government had just passed the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. It was a landmark piece of legislation. It was the strongest form of occupational health law that had existed for the coal mines, as well as safety regulations that had existed for coal mines in the United States up until that point, even though there'd been almost a century at that point of regulation of working conditions there. But despite the promise of the law and its big expanse and the big fanfare that it was received with, by the middle of 1970, coal miners in Western Pennsylvania realized it wasn't actually protecting their lives the way it was supposed to. There had been a series of deaths in the coal mines. They weren't, the huge disasters like the 78 men who'd been killed in 1968 in the Farmington explosion in nearby West Virginia. People often died in groups of 1 and 2, and it made local coverage, but it didn't get the national attention, even though the scale of death was still quite large, right? And you're talking about these small towns where maybe 3 or 4 people a year would be being killed in them in the coal mines. And so the union workers there in Western Pennsylvania, because this was one of the best organized sections of the coal industry in the United States, decided they were going to take matters into their own hands, and they would force the federal government to actually enforce the law that the miners had previously forced them to pass. And so over a series of months, they went on strike again and again. They defied injunctions from the companies, Bethlehem, U.S. Steel, Republic Steel, and ultimately were able to succeed in getting further enforcement of the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Acts. In this case, what that meant was actually having federal inspectors in the most dangerous mines in that region. They're mines that produced a lot of methane gas, and the miners who worked in them understood that that was an explosion waiting to happen. There were haulage accidents. So, in the period I was looking at, while these strikes were taking place, several men were killed by carts coming off of rails. There were machine accidents. And so what I saw here was, something that on one hand is relatively regionally confined, right? It's confined to this sort of ring counties around Pittsburgh. But it really ends up having a national impact. It goes all the way up through the courts of appeals and makes it possible for miners to force safety conditions in their workplaces, not just through grievance procedures that weren't operating as intended, not just through the Bureau of Mines, but to have the safety conditions in those mines scrutinized in court. And it gave them a new set of tools for actually trying to make their workplace safer. And, as dangerous as those coal mines were in 1970, workers' activism had made them a lot safer than they had been 20 years prior. And so when you see sort of this sort of arc of extremely, extremely dangerous coal mines becoming still dangerous, but, slightly safer over the 20th century, that's really credited to workers like these miners in Pennsylvania taking action in their own hands and refusing to let their lives be cheapened for cheap energy.
Yeah. I have to ask you, Trish, is this part of what happened, especially in Western PA 1970, was this part of the culmination of the 60s with the worker activism, civil rights? I mean, you had presidential assassinations, Martin Luther King, Vietnam, all these things. Kent State is another one. You had all these things simmering. And I mean, that was a volatile time in our history where people spoke out. They didn't like what was going on. Is that what happened in Western PA? Is that part of that?
So it's definitely part of that same moment of political activism. A lot of the people who are involved are also involved in democratization campaigns, are involved in speaking out against the war in Vietnam. But I also think it's really important to see it as part of a much longer arc of miners' activism against workplace violence, which really doesn't start in the 1960s, right? It goes back to the end of the 19th century when coal is becoming the primary fuel in the United States. And I think so on the one hand, you can look at it in that more narrow view and see it's part of this sort of general political uprising, labor uprising that's happening in the 60s, which miners are really at the leading edge of at this point. But there's also a part of it that's really like a culmination of generational struggle. And something that became really clear to me writing the book was how much that generational struggle really shaped what miners were doing. So for example, Harry Patrick, who's working in northern West Virginia at the time, he becomes the Secretary Treasurer of the United Mine Workers, had his father injured in the mine. He'd had a brother killed in the mine. And similarly, like Mike Trubovich, who's involved in these safety strikes, becomes the vice president of the UMW in 1972. Lost a very good friend who was, just a couple of weeks away from retirement and was pulled into a conveyor belt on the job, right, and just suffered this absolutely horrific death. And that constant surrounding of death and violence for me is really, both distinctive about the coal mines, even while it's sort of being part of these much larger political movements in U.S. politics.
Yeah, you got a history there, and obviously push comes to shove, and there's a point in people's lives that, we got to do something. We have to walk out. We have to get a better contract. We have to get some safety, and that's exactly what we're talking about. Our featured guest today on behalf of Labor 131 today is Trish Kolar. She's an assistant history professor. She takes a look at energy, work, and politics and the intersection there. We'll continue with her right after this. Once again, this is a special edition of America's Workforce, Labor 131, celebrating and commemorating the 131st anniversary of the creation of Labor Day. Back in a few minutes. You're listening to America's Workforce. This next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. You know, Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers, and miners. That was back in 1965, 60 years ago. That's when the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Well, today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care. Partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. Once again, another special edition of America's Workforce, where we take a look back into history, find out what we did, where we are now. And joining us as our featured guest on behalf of Labor 131 is Trish Kolar, who is an assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar. That's right, in the Middle East, in Qatar. Speaking of which, let's talk about the boy, I remember this. This is when I started in broadcasting, 1973, the Arab oil embargo. Boy, that changed everything. It really did. Before that, Trish, I don't know how old you are, but I used to fill up my car for about a couple of bucks. Gas was like 25, 30 cents a gallon. And boy, it just shot up. It tripled in some areas. Talk to me about wildcat strikes, gasoline shortages, all during that time. I'm sure you took a deep dive into that. Maybe you can reflect what happened then and how we are today on all of this. Go ahead.
I mean, this is one of those things when you're in the archive and it kind of just surprises you, because I think like you were talking about earlier, right? You have this sort of political moment of, Vietnam, labor activism, student activism. And I expected to see all of that when I was learning about this history. And I knew the oil embargo had happened. I didn't really recognize how relevant it was to the coal fields. But I came across actually a series of radio interviews, was actually where I first discovered this, where they were interviewing strike leaders who had decided to protest the lack of gasoline in the coal fields. And they made a really interesting claim to me. They said, we deserve access to gasoline because we produce coal, right? And so they were saying, we produce one kind of energy, so we have a greater right to other kinds of energy. And as the union dug into it, what they realized was that, in fact, West Virginia had been shorted their federal allotment of gasoline because of bad record keeping. And the union also thought the oil companies were shorting the state on gasoline as well. But again, this is another instance of sort of workers deciding to make a political claim, not just sort of fighting their employers, but also saying that, they had the ability to shape what the government was going to do and what policy that it would make. And so they said, they thought they could change the state of West Virginia's policies on how much gas miners were allowed to put in their tank. At that point, Arch Moore had said you can only put a quarter of a tank of gasoline in your car. But miners were often driving 50 plus miles to work, and that, could kind of leave them in a lurch if the gas station hours weren't aligned with their work schedule. And so all across southern West Virginia, they had shut down the coal mines, and Arnold Miller, who at that point is the reform leader of the Miners for Democracy, he's just been elected to the presidency of the UMW, and he decides that he's going to try and get the miners back to work, not by just forcing them back to work, but by actually trying to get their demands met. And it's one of the first instances I really see in labor history of really talking about energy fairness in really explicit terms. And so for me, it was something I became really interested in because it was sort of this early model where I was thinking not just about sort of politics at 30,000 feet, which is often how we think about oil politics, but really about how ordinary people are going to make decisions about where we should use energy, who should get access to it, and on what terms. And so I think this incident, even though it's relatively small, again, it's very confined to southern West Virginia, even though politicians are very concerned it will spread into Kentucky and Virginia. It really shows the possibility for ordinary working people to deliberate and make decisions about energy policy. It's not something that just has to happen in the halls of Congress.
We're talking about the politics of energy here. Did energy always be connected to politics in your research? Was it always like that, Trish?
I mean, I think as far as I've seen, energy is always political. I think the character of the relationship between energy and politics does change over the course of the 20th century. And one of the really important things that happens is the growth of electricity. What that does is it means lots of different fuels. So coal miners, oil workers, nuclear workers end up sort of having these relationships with each other that are not necessarily obvious from the work processes themselves. And in the late 1960s, OCAW, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers, actually, has some outreach to the UMW saying, we should pursue joint bargaining. We're not just coal miners, we're not just oil workers, we're energy workers. And it really demands that we think about bargaining in a different way. It doesn't go anywhere, but I think it's really indicative of this leading role that energy workers more generally had played in the development of industrial unionism. The other piece that plays a really big role is the growth of the oil companies into what we would see today as like a modern energy conglomerate, right? So they don't just own oil, they don't just own coal, they really own all kinds of energy.
Yeah.
The oil companies in particular buy up a lot of the coal companies. And it forces miners to think about leverage in a different way, again, because using leverage against these big conglomerate companies is more difficult than it had been when it was just a coal operator they were fighting against.
Have you taken a look? There's a lot about climate change. There's some people currently in the administration that really don't believe that. But some of the energy companies, they're embracing just about everything right now. And then you got the coal miners that are trying to save their jobs. Have you taken a look at that? And there's a lot going on in that arena. That's another show, too. But anyway, what have you found out in your research?
I mean, actually, one of the more interesting interactions I had was not with coal miners contemporarily, but with oil refinery workers in Whiting, Indiana, which is right outside Chicago when I lived there. And I think they were very much thinking in these terms. I think one of the lessons they're drawing forward from this period of the 1970s, and coal miners are doing this then, and I think they're sort of new moves in the UMW to try and embrace the politics of just transition. But what they really saw is that the working conditions in the refineries are really closely tied to environmental conditions in the communities that they live in, right? Because workers are often in these frontline communities. They're suffering the worst of the environmental damage. And then they can play a role in their workplace in trying to improve those environmental conditions. And people often don't see workers in these really dirty industries as people who are necessarily going to be involved in those struggles for environmental justice or energy justice. But I think all the way from the 1970s through the oil refinery strikes in the 2010s, you actually can see workers in these extractive energy industries really making those connections. And I think it's really about trying to find ways to support the workers who are on the leading edge of that, to think about what does it mean to tie workplace justice for those workers, because again, these are still very dirty, very dangerous workplaces, to forms of environmental transformation and climate justice that are maybe looking beyond a world that's built around fossil fuels.
I see you're working on your second book. By the way, we're speaking with Trish Kolar, who's an assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, I might add. And you're working on your second book, Everywhere Invisible, The Global History of American Electric Power. Can you give us a little snippet? I was reading a couple of notes about the relationship between electricity and the processes of racial formation and labor migration. Boy, you're really getting into some interesting stuff here. Maybe you could share, I don't know when this is coming out, and I know the research is ongoing. What can you share with our listeners at this point, Trish?
Well, so working on coal got me interested in electricity, particularly because in the later 1970s, I saw the utility companies doing basically negotiating with electric power. And I realized I hadn't really read a lot about the labor history of utilities, and I was really interested in it. I also thought it was really strange because the title, or the tentative title rather, Everywhere Invisible, to me is a way of hinting at that, electric workers live in every single community. They're all over the country. and yet they're largely invisible from sort of our received understandings of labor history. And so I started digging into that, and I quickly realized one really important thing, that in this story, the places where I could find records were largely of white workers or workers who were often immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the electrification of the United States lasts from 1880 to about 1960, and that overlaps really strongly with Jim Crow, and it overlaps really strongly with sort of the imperial peak of U.S. territorial expansion. And so I was like, I wonder if these things are connected. So I started looking into the impact of Jim Crow on electric workplaces in places like North Carolina, as well as the role of the U.S.'s empire building projects in shaping how people worked in the electric sector when workers were going from the United States to places like the Philippines or Puerto Rico. And so that's still very early on. It's been a very tough book to research. Unlike coal miners who had a long history of both being organized and also having their records kept in one place, I haven't had that same sort of luck with the repository of records. But what I think is really important about it is that it takes a story global and recognizes that energy systems are interconnected. They don't sort of stop at borders. I think people who live along the northern border of the United States will know that really well, because the electric power system there is deeply interlinked with Canada. And so using a national lens to think about electricity really wasn't going to tell the whole story. And so that's what I'm working on now. It's still really early on in the process, but it's been exciting and challenging. And I think it will be a really important part of thinking about the future of electricity, because electricity is really central to the process of decarbonization. It's going to be a really central part of energy and climate justice. But most of the things that think about what it means to electrify everything around us don't really think about the work of electrification. And I think those workers are going to be a really important part. Whether that's, people who are in unions like the IBEW doing house wiring, construction wiring, all the way through people who are line workers, and customer service representatives, and all of the other people who make utility companies run.
Boy, you are so right, because we all love our devices. So we are big consumers of energy, especially electricity. The other part is the data centers. And I could speak to that in central Ohio, which is not far from where we record this podcast. They're building Intel, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and all of those combined just suck up power. And then you got artificial intelligence facilities as well. I mean, they're huge. And this is going to be a conversation that's going to have to happen again and again, because it needs to be addressed. And it's a fast-moving target, too, I might add. But I appreciate what you brought to the table today. I love doing this because I find out so much information. And I know our listeners, we're getting a lot of feedback from the listeners on what we've been doing with Labor 131. So thank you so much for joining us. Our featured guest today, Trish Kolar, assistant professor, Georgetown University in Qatar. Thank you so much. And let us know when that second book comes out, okay?
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, the president of the Ohio AFL-CIO. Once again, you're listening to America's Workforce.